Next up, let me introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Mark McGallis. He's going to present for us on the Southern Forest Survey Climate and Weather Observations. Dr. McGallis is an Extension Associate Professor here at North Carolina State University. Mark, it's all yours.
Thanks, Robert. Welcome, everybody. It's gray and cloudy here today. I have to confess to you, I see quite a few webinars in a week's time. This is a unique one where I get to speak. So I've put away all my lunch items and I've shut off the emails, but you can go ahead and do that, especially if you're on mute. Go ahead and eat. I'll try to entertain you and get to some topics. But let me start by telling you that this information that we'll be presenting is really put together by a team of folks. I see Bill Hubbard's on the call. He and Leslie Bobby put together a huge survey of 6,000 foresters in the Southeast. And then what my graduate students, Rachel and Hillary, were able to do was to analyze that data in a strong way. So we're going to talk to you about that process today and what we found. But this isn't a climate change lecture per se. It's more about setting a baseline of where our foresters are. And as extension personnel, Bill and Bob and I are always looking to meet a need that's out there, but we need data to establish that. And so we'll tell you about this project and how it got started. Feel free to pump away the questions. This is really for your benefit. I will tell you that we started this talk, or it's been presented before through our landscape conservation cooperative here in the Raleigh area. Also presented it at SAF, so we got most of the kinks out of it. But it really starts, and the heart of it was Bill Hubbard's survey. We're going to tell you a little bit about the grant monies that made it possible and what we're after. And then I'd like to finish up by showing you some of the unique spatial results of some of that survey data and what we're hoping to glean from it. But we look for your input too, because you can help us interpret it and make sense of it. So the talk today is pretty straightforward. I think I've got about 25 slides. Tell you about how we got started, a little bit more about the survey results, and for those of you who entered early, there's a link to Bill's summary fact sheet. It's very graphic intense, so a couple minutes look at it and you'll get an idea where our foresters are. Today's topic is less about that and more about what's been observed out in the field. So how did this come about? Well, Bill and I and probably 8 or 10 other extension type folks have been actively working the last almost four solid years on a grant from the USDA Institute of Food and Agriculture. What's unique about this big project is we've put together the greatest minds in the South of those who wanted to play on the research, extension, and education realm. And the idea is whatever we found collectively, we disseminate out through the public and audiences like you. I suspect we have a lot of SFI company members here today, and that's really the folks who can deploy this new information out on the ground. So it's a true partnership, 11 universities, 17 different entities from the U.S. Forest Service to Bill's shop to the 50 and 60-year-old forest research cooperatives have brought their data to the table so we could take a look at it. So that PINEMAP goal, just in a nutshell, if you haven't heard about it, is to adapt our southern pine resources to whatever's coming down the pike, be it more rain or hotter temperatures, more intensive storms and the like. So it's been a real great cooperative. Now about the surveys, Bill has presented in multiple venues the results of the surveys, but I wanted to focus just on that top line today. What climate or other weather abnormalities or anomalies have foresters witnessed? So we got responses back from 1,200 foresters across the South, and we're curious about what does this mean for the future. So it's kind of establishing a baseline. The questions cover more weather, or maybe a 50-50 mix between extreme weather and climate, what weather's doing over time. So we'll take a look at some of that. In Bill's survey and the summary that I pushed out to you, we have a preponderance of foresters accepting that some kind of change is taking place. They vary on what's causing it, and the goal of our project is not to win over folks to the climate change debate. Our real goal, especially as extension folks, is to make sure we're managing the resource to whatever risks are coming down the pike. And we've had a unique opportunity to devote a fraction of our time in the last 4 years to really thinking about that issue. But we want to meet the foresters where they are, and this becomes some pretty good data, or the best that's out there to look at. So one of the questions in Bill's surveys read like this: in my lifetime, so that's that long, it may be a 30-year period, it may be a 60 or 70-year period, because a lot of our respondents have 40 years experience in the field, so you can imagine that they've seen a lot. But in this question, we ask them whether they've noticed a change in climate. And what I'd like you to see and kind of get used to in the graphs I send or present in the next few minutes, we have 5-point Likert scales. And if you remember back to your statistics classes, we're typically expecting a bell-shaped curve. Let me just get quiet for a minute so I can cough. Okay, back live. In this case, we're starting to see that what we anticipate as a bell-shaped curve slipping a little towards the right. So we've got about 40% of the folks, and then another 8 that strongly or agree that they've seen a change in the climate, for better or for worse. And as we broke this information out by state, and I'll leave this up here, again, we have that 5-point scale that will remain the same throughout this talk. The number 1 represents never, and number 5 on the high side is very frequently. So we get most of our folks there in the middle. And on average, that red line for the whole region, we're looking at a little bit more than the midpoint. And some states really rise to our attention. Kentucky, Oklahoma, and we'll see those states showing up a little bit more. So kind of train your eyes to where your state location is. They're in alphabetical order. The last category after Virginia is for those foresters who are working in 2 or more states. And we had quite a few of those in our survey. So to make this data relevant, at least locally and spatially, Rachel went through all those data points and took the foresters who are working in multiple states and put them in their own category. And they kind of represent an average for the whole group. So that's where we are on the issue of climate, or at least the perception that the climate has changed. The black confidence intervals represent your 95% confidence level. Oops, get a little happy. So what I'm presenting here, and you can see in the color scheme, those items that we asked about are in red, represent the highest observation, usually above that number 3 level. And those were significant. And we'll take a look at some of the statistics that show that. In the yellower or kind of cautionary areas are the things that ranked about in the middle. Folks are seeing them, but not as frequently. And then in the the coolest color, the green, and also the smallest font, which represents the lowest frequency of observation, are the things that would suggest the climate is changing, but in a cooler way. So this is in Bill's summary, but I bring it up here just because in one snapshot you get a rough idea of what the rest of the talk will be about. So invasive plants leads the list, and whether that's a function of our management regimes or our porous borders for these pests and plants, or actual change in the weather and climate, we'll address that, but it's a top concern to our folks, and we're going to need to tackle that risk regardless of the cause. So I mentioned, or maybe I meant to mention, that 16 different climate observations or weather anomalies that were listed in, and folks had a chance to check off on them. So this is just a percentage or a summary of the top 4 observations that floated up to the top, and that percentage there is a summary of all our respondents who either voted 3, 4, or 5, the upper range of the survey responses. So longer dry periods or intensified droughts, 84% responded in that way. Warmer winters, about the same measure, about 82%. The invasive plant number, although it led the last chart, we'll see that that was not universal across the South. So we have some hot spots, and those will be apparent. And actually, Rachel's research was able to draw that out of this great information. And then hotter summers. So about 3/4 of the folks are at least observing that or have in their lifetime. So that's kind of what they perceive and what's going on. But more importantly, and I'd like to stress this next slide, we're dealing with humans that have a lot on their mind, but we tend to work through the things that we're most concerned about. And again, what rises to the top is that increase in invasive plants. And this is a smaller point scale of how concerned folks were. So on the upper end, somewhat to very concerned, we've got the majority of folks on these 5 topic areas. So invasive plants first, longer dry periods and droughts, increased insects, fire, and disease. So we're looking at the same issues that we've always faced. Maybe invasives is the newest kid on the block, but we've got to come up with the management schemes to deal with these. And once again, they've got to be sustainable. So they have to make ecological sense, economic sense, and they've got to be acceptable to the public or to the people who own the land we're managing. So that kind of sets the stage for it. Armed with that information that came from Bill's survey, we kind of put our heads together, and the old guard, Bill and I, don't necessarily have all the skill sets we need to tackle this, and that's where the younger generation of graduate students has been able to help us. Could we look at this data and kind of pull it out on a state-by-state basis? And what might it tell us? We think something's going on, but without looking at it in a detailed manner, we couldn't really tell for sure. So I started pulling out the data and looking at it in a similar way, I guess last summer, putting together little frequency diagrams. And to the extent that some of them didn't look like others, I sensed something was going on. At that time, Rachel had just taken a GIS class and statistical class looking at spatial statistical tests. And so we actually employed her to take a look at that. And so the big question we're looking at, are foresters seeing the similar trends? We know what they're seeing across the region, but can we tease it out on a state-by-state or regional basis? And that's what the rest of the talk will hopefully get after. So the first things we had to look at were the means, and this is going back to that diagram or our bell-shaped curve. We knew something was shifting that curve to the right. 3 being the midpoint, folks are seeing it more than occasionally and working their way too frequently. And what are those things? Invasives again, longer drier periods or drought conditions. And you see we've got pretty high standard deviations here too. So we had folks approaching very frequently or frequently and fewer on the rare or never side. So that's our top 3. But of equal interest too was the folks that were rarely seeing cooler winters. Now again, this data is 2 years old. The numbers might have bumped a little in the last couple of years where we've had the turn of events with these Arctic depressions that have brought down the colder winter, at least for a little time. But no increased erosion or rarely seeing that, and rarely seeing cooler summers. But we can anticipate this in the future. As we get swings, our average will stay fairly close, but we'll start seeing extremes on both ends of the spectrum. So if we deploy these statistics, then we can start teasing region-wide differences and even state-to-state differences. And these numbers are for your study later on, but we're able to actually move another observation up into our top 4, and that was drier planting seasons. Just a change in the weather over the long time. We're changing the climate where we're seeing a greater frequency of drier planting, and we'll show you which states that shows up. But by and large, these are the same numbers that came up on average, except a new one comes to the table. That number 2 is a greater frequency and severity of fire events. And the statistical significance here is that we're able to tease out those places in the region or the state-by-state comparisons where the numbers that showed up are beyond what the statistical random numbers we'd expect. So that's an indication that something's going on, and we'll take a look at that. You'll see it for yourself. So getting back to these tables we've looked at, you can tease a little bit out of them, at least the states that are up above the average. Kentucky, again, rises to the forefront. But North Carolina, Virginia, and even Alabama rise above that mean level. Again, 1 being the never, and 5 being very frequently. So we're getting that movement to the right on the bell curve. So what does it look like on a state-by-state basis? Think about these as a quartile map where the hottest red is the top 25%, the pinkish being the second 25 percentile or quarter of the sample. Then we go into the lighter blue or Carolina blue being that lowest, the third to the last quartile, and then the deepest blue, Texas and Arkansas, would represent the lowest 25%. So we toggle back. This is the same information that's in this graph, but in probably a more intuitive way of representing what's going on. So if we want to compare the greatest extremes, Texas comes out at the lowest of this sample in terms of invasive plants, and then Kentucky is in that frequent category. But similar to some of those northern tier states, and then Alabama and Florida. So let's look at the second in our grouping here. You see our mean drops a little bit below 3, or that occasional. And if you remember, our sampling period is in 2013, just followed some bad and hot fire years. But we've got Oklahoma and Texas above that mean, and certainly significance, no overlap of their confidence intervals. So what does this look like on the ground or on the big map? A real difference across the region, and perhaps an intuitive one if we were to just guess at it. Where our moisture drops off on the other side of the Mississippi, we're going to have problem with drought, and in this case, severe fire events. So in first and second position then, Oklahoma and Texas, but representing different parts in the quartile breakout. So Oklahoma in the top 25%, Texas, if you will, on the top 50%, and then the eastern half of states on the lower half of the frequency thing. So there's our mean below 3 and just the breakout. So we have a wide disparity from east to west. So let's look at drought conditions. I think intuitively this is one that looks like it would be an east-west breakout, just like the fire frequency. But we see a few other anomalies out here in the east with Florida and Georgia. So let's see how that map breaks out. You see in the top quartile, the dark reds, there's Oklahoma and Texas to no surprise, but Florida is popping up. And then in the second quartile, we go to South Carolina, Georgia being the hottest, but or the driest, at least in this sample. But Louisiana is kind of a different one too, along with South Carolina. So periodic droughts or dry periods, we can anticipate that while they may be infrequent, more folks are seeing them as part of their forestry career. Now here's one that should ring home with the reforesters that we have in our audience today. Some of the same trends with Oklahoma and Texas in the lead, but similar to the drought slide that we saw earlier, we get a similar pattern or a close pattern where Florida and Georgia now have moved up into that top quartile. Now again, these are foresters' observations, but it's part of their job, and I think there's a lot of weight to these things. And this, you know, as we talk to climatologists, whether you're in a La Nina or El Nino year, when and where and to the extent how much winter rainfall we get is a big determinant. And for foresters who've hung in there these several decades, they might have that information, or the scarcity of water during planting season may come to the forefront. Now those were the maps that allow us to start honing in on discussions, whether it's relative to risk management or changing in our approaches. You know, we can go to containerized seedlings. We might move our planting season back into a more likely to get rain type of event. We may stay away from late season planting, a number of things. Well, what I wanted to leave you with today are a couple of the things that suggest some of this change, even though it differs from state to state, can be fairly universal. And one is the warming of the winter temperatures. Now, by the numbers we have, we can get pretty tight confidence intervals. Some states are seeing warmer winters than others, but by and large, we're seeing a preponderance of warmer rather than cooler winters. And that suggests a change in our average seasonal temperature, which may ultimately turn out to be a change in our climate, measurable 20 or 30-year cycle that something's going on. So there's the winter temperature, and we find a similar representation. Again, hotter summers across the board. Some states like Oklahoma rise above the others. I think the year before the sampling was done, they reached, 2 or 3 months of 95 or higher degree temperatures. So that's not out of the realm of possibilities of what we can see in other parts of the South in the future as we look at projections. So when we break out a lot of those climatic observations, we see differences by state, and this is where we have probability 0.05. There's a 1 in 20 error that these were down just by the sampling process. But I think when you see that some of these states rising to the surface many times, something's seemingly going on. So Florida, Oklahoma, of course, a few for North Carolina, but the invasive plant infestations in Kentucky, insect damage, and extreme rainfall rise to the surface. Just a few areas where we think we can do some risk programming and managing and get folks thinking about that into the future. So what does this all mean? We're about 33 minutes into the effort. We've been able to show some significant observational differences across the South and made by Southern foresters like you here on the call today. More importantly, from an extension standpoint in this PINEMAP effort, is that we can now start focusing our outreach in a way that makes the most sense here in the South. Whether we call it climate change programming or risk management or resiliency training, we want to combine our best knowledge of what's on the minds and concerns or suggest a real risk to our foresters out in the field, and then get those resilient actions on the ground, whether it's thinning or planting on the right site or changing our genetics to better handle what's coming down the pike. That's our real goal. So I'm going to open up for questions here, get a drink of water, and see what's come up on the chat room. And if nothing, I will wax philosophically with whatever questions Bob comes up with. But I thank you for your time. I hope it was clear.
Thank you, Mark. So at this time, folks, let's give Mark a quick break to get a drink of water and everything, and then we'll go into questions. So if you do have questions for today's session, please enter them into the chat room, and we will answer them one at a time. So I'll give you guys a minute to think of some questions that you might have and you want answered, so please enter them in there. While you guys are working on that, I just want a quick reminder to you that if you've joined the session for continuing education credits, you'll need to complete the satisfaction survey at the end of today's session and take and pass the short quiz. Once you've done that, you'll need to complete the continuing education unit request form and then certify that you've participated in the webinar in its entirety. And that's basically clicking on a little checkbox for that. The system will then, once you've met all those requirements, will email you your certificate. So we'll be set there.
So, Bob, I see a question from Mary Morrison. I'd love to see what I can do relative to tackling it. So, Mary asks, the extreme events create tipping points for many species. Are you looking at what might be the tipping point for species? So on this PINEMAP grant, in addition to extensionists like Bill and I and Eric Taylor from Texas, we have real tree physiologists and geneticists looking at this in depth. We've got some long-term we call them Tier 3 sites, but we've actually looked at reducing the rainfall by 30%. We have rainfall excluders, and in many cases we've been able to track the tipping point relative to productivity and the ability of the tree to sustain itself. But yes, I think we've got sampling on all those sites from fertilization, what's going on with their respiration, net product, net site productivity, and those things. Fortunately, when we're dealing with our planted pines and loblolly in particular, we look at the extreme ends of their range, whether we go west to where things drop off or as we go too far south and they may not compete. But we've got sampling points at the edge of those ranges, and the tipping point is a significant one. A good question, I think we're going to have our specialty type plants, or the specialists that need a certain area or endemic to a region, that their tipping points are going to be reached a whole lot sooner and maybe out of the blue than our generalists like the pines that we're looking at. But we were specifically asked in this grant to mitigate the carbon emissions that were going up into the air, and having healthy, viable pine plantations that have an economic driver and the ability to sequester carbon in the long term as building products and the like are helping us. I mean, that was the intent, that we avoid some of these tipping points. But yeah, whether it's weather, temperature, or moisture, I'm sure we're going to be seeing the extirpation or extinction of more species in this age of man that we're calling it. Hope that gets to your question, Mary.
Okay, Mark, the next question that we have is from Chris Demers. And to what extent does climate influence invasive species relative to other factors?
So Chris, as the politicians say, I'm no scientist. I have to defer to some of the physiologists. I can tell you some of the reading on not invasives necessarily, but poison ivy. They talk about it responding better to warmer temperatures and a higher carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. I think longer growing seasons and maybe a lack of a dying frost or a cold winter, things will allow for the expansion of range. So this invasive question, it may be an expansion of range, as we've seen with some of the plant hardiness zones. But it's a multitude of factors, from porous borders to just more aggressive plants than are endemic or native species. So I think it's a part of the answer. It's not the whole thing.
All right. So from James Maston, why is increase in frequency of invasive plants considered a function of climate change rather than length of period since introduction of plants into the ecosystem? So
I don't think it is necessarily. I think it's just one of the questions that was on this questionnaire and happened to get lumped into this discussion. So I would not make a direct correlation to it. I think, as you say, there's a latent period when the introduction of the plants before they take off and the birds learn about them and they get expanded. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. I think also it may point out to differences in forest type. If you saw the northern range of the South, at least those states, border states, Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, are moving up into the hardwood system and may have fewer pine plantations, where we tend to have pretty quick turnover of, it's an early successional habitat. We're using herbicides, and we may have invasives, but they're going to get controlled at the end of the rotation. Whereas if you get into the hardwood type herbicides and long rotations, it may just be a function of the ecosystems or the forest types. So, good question. But if we anticipate a moving upward of some of these plant zones, then we can anticipate the invasives going with them. Good question.
Okay, here's one from Sam Lammy. He's wondering if there are any general insect observations in terms of population trends.
I wonder about that too. I don't think that was part of the, if we asked about specific types. I know in our area, the southern pine beetle, observances have been way down, but in their place seemingly a lot more ips infestations. So I suspect that being a fairly regional thing. When I did ask a few of the, we saw some of the early results of the Kentucky being on the top of the list relative to invasives, they suggested that emerald ash borer and some of the things coming out of the lake states, they were just being bombarded by plant and insect invasives. So where you have shipping and transportation and ports of entry, I think you'll have specific insects to worry about. Here in North Carolina, we've had gypsy moth on our northern border, and then seemingly the things coming up from the south, ambrosia beetle and the like. We're getting it from all sides, and Tennessee is the thousand canker disease is coming over our border there too. So it really depends where you're situated and your mix of species. But good question. Maybe it's something we need to follow up on.
So before we go on to the next question, I have just uploaded to the webinar a summary of the research. It's so you can actually save this file to your computer and read it later, or if you prefer, you can go to the forestrywebinars.net for today's webinar topic, and you can actually download it there as well as a copy of the presentation slides that Mark gave today. So moving into our next question, this one is from Gary. He's wondering what work is planned, advice, actions, etc. for managers to a much overlooked forest fuel, organic soils. There is an abundance of this neglected fuel in the southeast, Gulf states, lake states, and Alaska, but when it ignites, has the tremendous impacts.
All right, Gary. Good to know you're still out there, buddy. We can talk after this webinar about that. There is actually, as part of this research, quite a few of our researchers and their other work are looking into situations there on the Alligator River National Refuge, and are doing some work there. So we've got Asko Normitz and Geeson and some of the other folks, McNulty, working there simultaneously and in support of this PINEMAP effort. So some good work there. Also, I saw a webinar from Bob Minkler the other day through our GIS group, and some good results there. That takes care of North Carolina. I can't necessarily speak for the other groups.
All right. So a question from Cheryl, and she's wondering, better land management is expected to increase resiliency to climate change effects. And she's wondering, do you know of evidence or current research into this area?
So that's a great question, and part of the effort and some of the summary work that will come out of this big grant is the notion of, can we start tailoring silvicultural management techniques, or even the extent or the types of fertilizers used, or the herbicides that can get a stand through a drought. These are the things we're trying to quantify. In fact, there's 2 efforts underway. I'll start with the one that should be out in a few months, and that's a decision support tool to help land managers start looking at what the future may be in 20 years, 30 years, whatever the end of our rotation may be, and looking at altering or selecting a better suited genetic family or combination of families that may get us through the drier times or potentially wetter times, depending on where you are and what that future might look like. So that's in the works, and part of it is to also have the economics and the modeling behind it, so you could kind of experiment through a model as to what your results might be, or at the very least minimize the risks associated with going that course versus staying the current course. Hope that helped. A lot of that work is being done. You heard today from a couple of us, or at least the work we've done. We're waiting on that to do the outreach associated with that. So I hope you'll be hearing more from this effort as time goes on, and beyond that 5-year grant that we've had to work on.
So here's one from James Maston.
Our colleague in Texas, Eric Taylor, is trying to put some numbers on the exact, if we go this route and thin to a certain basal area on this soil in eastern Texas, what can that do for us in terms of increased productivity or reduced risk? So it is being talked about and looked at.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So James Maston is asking a question. The length of time that foresters has practiced in history of weather for recent years would seem have a great deal of influence on survey response. What consideration was given to the factors in the survey?
So it was not a part of this talk today, but Hillary Morris looked at that specifically on what one would assume that our foresters who have 40 years of experience would be more inclined to have seen a shift or an observation in weather or climate observations. But in truth, the more recently it's been since you've gotten out of school, the lack of tenure seems to have you more inclined to see these observations. Also, I think there's a part of the human configuration that we over-remember or we under-remember things that are out past our last 2 or 3 year reference period, or maybe it's 5 years. But a lot of work needs to be done on that. But in terms of acceptance of climate change as a concept, it's focused on younger folks, more recently out of school, young women, or younger women in general, and then those with longer time in school, more degrees. But we've also broken it out by classifications, who you work for, public versus private, and industry, consulting foresters. Seems to be the more years of experience they have, if they're a consulting forester, the less they attribute this to a recent change. Hope that helps.
Okay, next question is from Jessica. She's wondering if, she states, forests harbor more than just timber and are habitat for much wildlife. Have you looked into the effects of climate change on specific species in the stands that are being affected the most?
That's a great question, and I think probably the biologists are more on the forefront of this, whether they're with the land trust or agency folks. And it's hard to make generalizations, but your species that are endemic to a certain area, or a certain soil type, a moisture regime, they seem to be the most at risk. There's some hope and suggestion that just as with the last ice age, that many of our species will be able to move with interstate systems and urban development. I don't know how smooth that transition will play. It's the rapidity of this warming that's got folks scared. I mean, to stay in advance of this warming, the ability of a plant to be carried or by wind or even animals is way outstripped by some of the warming that's taking place. So to answer your question, folks are looking at that. There are many wonderful vulnerability assessments, they call them, to kind of track what forest types or plants or even wildlife species are most at risk. Cold water species, trout, native trout, a lot of work being done on those going back 20 years now. So it's those things that are related to warming. Some of them are also related to cooling cycle. How much or how many cooling degree days are needed for a plant to survive or animal to be protected. Sometimes it will surprise you. The moose in the Northeast, maybe in some of the lake states, the lack of cold weather is having them succumb to tick diseases and fleas and things that are just sucking them dry. So harvest levels are going down because the natural mortality is so great. So it really depends where you are, what you're looking at. But yes, lots of work being done on that. And some entities like the Nature Conservancy trying to get out ahead of it. If they're going to lose their habitat to sea level rise or the like, how to move those endemic or endangered species ahead of what's coming. Great question, Jessica.
Okay, this last chance for any more questions. While we wait to see if one or two more might come in, I will push out the link to participate in the satisfaction survey. And for those of you that are going after continuing education credits, remember you will also have to complete the quiz. What will happen is when I push it out, your browser should be opening up on your computer on the survey page itself. Be patient. There's 73 of us still on the system, and so it's trying to load all of us at once. So it may take a little bit of time for that to happen. Since it doesn't look it looks like there may be a problem from a timing-wise on the survey, so hold on a second, folks. We'll get that quickly fixed.